Welcome to the grand finale of the Election Whisperer DNC Convention Spectacular. And this finale you've been waiting for is going to be fantastic. It is an interview with the one and only Guy Cecil, who runs the most important Democratic super PAC, Priorities USA, huge super PAC. And you might be wondering how the Democrats end up with a super PAC since they hate super PACs and they hate campaign finance. Well, they also hate losing and not ever having power. And once upon a time, the Democrats worked really, really hard to reform campaign spending and make campaigns less, corrupt. And so they finally get this capstone piece of legislation through Congress, working with John McCain, the McCain-Feingold Act of 2000, and it's this big omnibus campaign finance bill. Over time, all this types of different, litigation happens because of that bill. One of them results in a couple of court cases, but the capstone piece is this case called Citizens United versus the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And in that case establishes that corporations, unions, trade unions, things like that, could, because of free speech, have and create, separate from campaigns and candidates, their own spending organizations. And those organizations could not be regulated by the FEC and could not be subject to donation limits the way that candidates could. Candidates have very strict donation limits from individuals, 2,500 or might have gone up a little bit from that per cycle that they're running in. And so this FEC or Supreme Court case establishes it blows the top off of the campaign finance system. So if you're a little bit younger, you have basically your political awareness time period has always existed in this Wild West super PAC world. But it's a very different world from the world that existed through the 2000s. And as it came in, the Democrats were like, oh my God, we don't like big money, but if we don't have one too, we'll get obliterated. And frankly, they've never really been able to compete well in the super PAC space, though Obama's and priorities have done pretty good. And in this interview, you're going to hear a little bit about how Guy Cecil got involved in priorities after it was running for a couple of years and really, really increased its reach and what it was doing and tried to model it a little bit better off of what Republicans ended up doing with their super PACs, which was to create permanent campaign infrastructure that could really keep Republicans competitive and ready to go. So we're going to jump into this interview with Guy and learn a little bit about what Priorities does, a little bit of what they're doing now and all the organizations that they work with and what they are looking at for 2020. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Election Whisperer, DNC Convention Spectacular. I am so excited about this interview because I have here in the Election Whisperer hot chair today, I have Guy Cecil, woo! And he is the chair of the biggest Democratic super PAC, Priorities USA. And I believe it was commissioned in 2012 to help Barack Obama deal with this new campaign environment that suddenly existed post the big Supreme Court decision you all have heard of, Citizens United, in which corporations, trade unions, others could spend unlimited amounts of money through these, PACs, but were actually called super PACs because they had unlimited donations. And on the left, this is a big issue because for a long time, money in politics had been a hot issue on the left. The McCain-Feingold campaign reform bill had been championed and really meant to rein in spending. And Barack Obama, actually didn't take public financing for his campaign election in 2008. That was a major change, and he had initially pledged to do so. And when he decided to reject it, that took a lot of headlines. But he was getting so many small donations, he actually would have hurt himself to do that. So he rejected the public financing so he could raise more money. The progressive left was not a big fan of the idea of the left creating super PACs, but I can assure you, Democrats would have gotten just absolutely killed if they did not. So Guy gets tasked with this job. go create the first really big Democratic super PAC. And I am going to start the interview there because, it's one thing to talk about super PACs now here in 2020, 8 years after they've been operating. But Guy, you had no blueprint and you can't create it the way that the Republicans did because, it's a very different environment in that Republican super PAC world. And you have to consider optics. You just can't escape them. So tell me a little bit about this task that you're given to go out there and keep Barack Obama competitive against Mitt Romney in a new campaign finance Wild West.
Yeah, so I spent most of my career on the federal side, in Senate campaigns, at state parties, and at the DSEC. And I actually didn't join Priorities until 2015. It was originally created by Obama folks in 2012, and then I joined in 2015 as the Clinton campaign and the general election campaign started getting more attention for the 2016 election. And so most of my experience had been on the federal side, but I had watched firsthand how Senate candidates, incumbents, and challengers, and really in races across the country were getting outspent, especially early, by the Republican Party and by conservative super PACs, and also conservative interest groups like the Christian Coalition. And
Right.
despite the fact that every single Democrat, including me, would support Citizens United, the reality was we could not afford to unilaterally disarm, and we needed to make sure that we were taking the fight to Republicans, not just in the last couple of months of the campaign, but early. And so that's when I decided to join Priorities. And then following 2016, we actually expanded our operation, and we included not just the C4, but also the Priorities USA Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is in particular involved in voting rights litigation around the country and taking on, in particular, conservative efforts to suppress the vote through legislation.
Which has become, of course, and we're going to spend some time on this considerably, actually, because I didn't know if viewers were aware that Priorities had moved into this area, and I wanted to hear, especially now, what it's like on those front lines, which is not, it's not become, I mean, it's become so much more heated and so much more aggressive on the Republican side, beyond voter ID and to the point where, we're going to first come after the post office, and then we're going to make it illegal for you to personally drop your ballot off in person, so you have to use this post office system. So, but before we get to that, okay, so you are watching then, at least from a pretty, important role in federal campaigns, running and helping with these Senate campaigns, this campaign finance system evolve, this post Citizens United system. And you're noticing, of course, that Republicans, because they have, this corporate world, which, has so many people with very deep pockets in it, kind of an advantage, right? And, you're watching Priorities. What was your relationship like with the super PAC as it first emerged? Like with the people who ran it, did you have any connection?
Yeah, well, obviously, in politics, we all have probably at some point worked one with the other. And so you build those types of relationships in the races that you do at the local and the federal level. But really up until 2015, when I joined Priorities, I had watched from the other side of the wall. And I think one of the things that folks don't understand about the advantage that the other side has, not just in terms of super PACs, but the entire conservative infrastructure, is not just on television. So much of the attention is on television advertising, how many ads get run, how early they get run, where they're getting run. But really what was happening on the conservative side was that super PACs and C4s and all of this infrastructure was existing 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They were building permanent infrastructure online so that by the time the candidates came along and started advertising, the reality was so much of the groundwork had been laid by conservatives. And so that's when we decided that Priorities shouldn't just be a 3 or 4 month or 6 month out of the year activity focused on the presidential alone, but rather we should focus on building progressive infrastructure, democratic infrastructure that can compete with the other side, because that's where their real advantage was. It wasn't in September and October of the election year. It was in August of the off year.
Right. And so when you came in 2015, that's when that pivot happened, or did it come after the 2016
It
election
started in
cycle?
2015, but it really accelerated after 2016. That's when we decided
Okay.
to focus on Senate and House races and down ballot races. And we started investing in infrastructure. We started investing in groups like Run for Something. We started building our own internal
Good.
infrastructure so that today, 100%, for example, of our digital buying happens internally at Priorities. We don't use consultants. Most of our creative work happens inside of Priorities. And we decided we needed to do some of these things to stay competitive with conservatives and the Republicans as they were building this infrastructure year round.
That's really interesting. Yeah, the reason I guess as a like an outsider looking in, I kept kind of honing in on priorities is when I think about the conservative super PAC space, I could sit here and list like five, maybe even 10 pretty vibrant and active super PACs. And when I think about the space on the left, it's a much more narrow field in terms of vibrancy. There are, of course, always candidate specific PACs in the presidentials, especially nominations. But in terms of that left field. So it is exact. You're basically affirming exactly why I kept, looking at priorities as this, big player in the space because it was, and it was a very different. This is just one more manifestation, actually, in what I keep having a broader conversation about these electioneering differences between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And in this case, as you had noted, this was a deficiency that was hurting Democrats because the Republicans were building permanent infrastructure that was allowing them, a massive mobilization and just a huge structural advantage that they could draw on. So, can you tell me then, as you guys started to amp up, how many groups, or do you have maybe you don't know specifically, but which groups are you most excited have kind of been activated or brought into this infrastructure?
Well, I think there are sort of two types of groups that we work a lot with. You have, issue-oriented groups that are focused on a range of specific issues like League of Conservation Voters, which has been around and engaged in the political space and really over the last, I'd say, 4 to 6 years has significantly expanded their operation. But you also have organizations that have been typically activist organizations, on the ground organizations that have moved into the election space. Color of Change would be a great example. They have had such an influence on DA's races and have now moved into other local and state races. We work collaboratively with them. Groups like the Latino Victory Fund that are focused on electing Latinos to office, but also supporting candidates that are in favor of issues that benefit not just issues around immigration, which is typically how it gets pigeonholed, but all of the issues that affect Latino voters, the economy, healthcare, education. They're doing a lot of really important work in this space. And then there are new groups and emerging groups that I think are pretty exciting. Faith in Public Life, which continues to get more involved in this type of work. Black Church PAC, which is doing more political work this cycle. And so I don't, we get attention because of the amount we raise and that we've been around the longest, but there are a lot of really important groups that are building really critical infrastructure around digital and training and recruiting people to run for office that I think is building out the progressive and democratic infrastructure. We are not a command and control party.
Right.
We don't have $100 million donor that's building and controlling the right like the Koch brothers did for so long. We are building out and working with a lot of groups who are involved in this space because we are a more diverse party. And frankly, we had a lot of work to do after 2016 at the election level, at the activist level, at the training level, to really build out a lot of the party which had been ignored for a long time.
No, I agree, and I know that you and I have previously discussed the priorities work on the ground in Florida. Can you? I know without giving away any trade secrets or any competitive advantages, could you kind of illustrate for people who might be watching and interested thinking about how they might get involved, maybe money-wise, maybe personally in terms of volunteering for some of these groups. Talk a little bit about how these groups come alive, or these actions translate into direct, technique or whatever you're doing to improve Democratic campaign fortunes in Florida, which I think for many Democrats is a very frustrating state, because they look at it, and my model confirms this, as a state that they should be winning and yet come up empty time after time.
Well, as a native Floridian, I was born and raised in Miami, and so I share some of that frustration because I've been involved in Florida for quite some time, and I think one of the challenges in Florida is just the lack of elasticity in the race in the state. That we always have close elections. That we've seen, especially in 2018. I think there was a lot of frustration and disappointment at what happened at the Senate level and at the governor's level, but Florida is fundamentally a close state, and we can and should win there in 2020 if enough organizations, enough groups, enough activists focus on making sure that we are engaged in that state. And so we're involved in a number of levels. First of all, Donald Trump's digital operation got a lot of attention. Some of it rightly so, and some of it a result of smoke and mirrors. And for the last 3 years, we heard about their operation and what they were doing nationally. The reality was that since July of last year, priorities has actually been outspending Donald Trump online in Florida, along with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so, first of all, our work involves making sure that people have access to the ballot box. We've been involved in 2 pieces of litigation in Florida. The first was preventing the state from banning public colleges and universities from serving as early vote locations. And the second was around issues related to early vote and voter education. Second, we've been involved on the digital side. I think there's a lot of conversation about persuasion and mobilization, and we think a lot of times these are false definitions of how voters engage in this process. I mean, for example, 1 out of every 5 of our so-called persuadable targets in Florida are Latino or Hispanic.
That's right.
We understand that in Florida, diversity in the Hispanic and Latino community is unlike any other state, that you have such a vast range of communities and people who have come from South America, Central America, Cuba. And so we don't treat people in these isolated buckets. We're just trying to figure out in Florida how to build the broadest coalition of fair-minded people who are open to a democratic message. We're obviously running television ads in Florida. We'll be up again in the fall there. And then we've been investing on the ground. In 2016, we invested on the ground through an organization called Black Pack. And we'll do some of that work as we head into the fall of this year.
Yeah, so that sounds to me like positive movement and a lot more investment than we had seen previously in the state. Now, I was of the opinion that a female person of color as a running mate would be an asset to the Biden team, even though it's very hard empirically to show a vice presidential pick in terms of public opinion data to call voters and say, hey, would Kamala Harris make you more likely to vote? Because sadly, most voters did not know who Kamala Harris was for the general election. Most people in the bubble, people who are on Twitter, who are following political news, people like you and me, but even further down in interest, just enough to follow political news, think that everyone would know somebody after a presidential primary. But the fact is that her name recognition is probably not better than maybe 50 or 60% of the general election. Now it's much higher, obviously. So asking somebody, you assume that, they knew she was a female person of color. And if they didn't know, how are they going to, show a race effect, right? So it's very difficult to show those things. So what do you guys think? You've been on the ground now for a week since the selection, almost a week. Are people excited?
Yes. And not just Democrats, by the way. I think a lot of times we get forced into identifying a candidate that might be good for one community or another. But I think what Kamala Harris's experience shows, what her electoral experience shows, and what our polling shows since the pick is that she actually appeals to a broad range of people. And I think she's going to be a huge addition to the ticket, not just because of turning out African-American voters, although I think that she will help with that, not just in appealing to women, although I think she'll help continue the movement of women towards the Democratic Party. But I think she appeals to a pretty broad cross section of voters. And ultimately, I think as people get to know her, as we start talking to people about her, we're finding a pretty positive response. And so I think she's a great addition to the ticket, not just because she is a historic choice, but because I think she'll be a great candidate. And I think she's going to be a terrific vice president for Joe Biden.
That's great. And then to close out our interview, because I know that you have time constraints, you're trying to win elections. I do want to talk a little bit about that final new, and very important work that that your organization is engaged in, because it has been increasingly combative this last decade as Republicans made this turn, and they had to make a decision with the Republican so-called autopsy report that Reince Priebus authored after Mitt Romney's loss in 2012, where he cautioned the party, look, our rhetoric and our policy positions are becoming hostile to too many groups, young people, to Latino voters, and of course, to African Americans for a long time. And with the change of demographics for America's future, this is basically party suicide, and we should do a triangulation. And he basically gets, this causes Eric, in the mythos anyway, Eric Cantor to lose his primary, and the party decides instead to go, definitely the other way, and Donald Trump's the nominee, and so on and so forth. And that so ends the GOP civil war and the soul for the Republican Party. And now the entire brain trust of the Republican Party is going to be in my RNC special, which will be the next week after this special. So they move in part of buying this, needing to win elections with a increasing minority of voters into this voter suppression package. And I think it's important to speak about it very frankly, and I always have, even when it was more subtle. Let's pass a voter restriction ID law. Let's get rid of early voting. Let's move polling locations from college campuses. I always thought it was very important to speak very frankly about what the purposes of those laws are doing. But now we're talking about much more aggressive techniques to undermine a free and fair election, which is the underpinning of a democracy. So tell me a little bit about what Priority is doing, especially as the Republican Party under Trump has ramped up to such an aggressive platform of election suppression.
Well, I think it's pretty simple. If you can't win with the electorate you have, then you try to pick your own electorate. And this is what we've seen happening. This isn't just under Donald Trump. I think one of the most catastrophic failures of the media is their lack of coverage of what has happened in voting rights and voter suppression over the last 8 years. This has been a systemic, widespread, national effort. In every state where there has been a conservative legislature and a conservative governor, it has been made more difficult to vote. In every state where there's been a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature, it has been made easier to vote. And that is not by accident. This is intentional, and it's not new. I mean, when I worked on the ground in Arkansas in 2002, I remember having to call the press in and threaten a lawsuit because Republicans were taking pictures of African Americans as they were walking up to an early vote location. The difference is it's not being hidden anymore. That's Donald Trump is saying publicly what has been said in the back room for a long time. And so we're suing. We've been suing now for almost 5 years. We've been involved in 17 pieces of litigation. And this shouldn't be a partisan issue. We should be doing everything we can to make sure everybody has fair and equitable access to the ballot box. There should be universal registration. There should be early vote and vote by mail made accessible to people, and especially now when people are being forced to decide whether they're going to put their health at risk or whether they're going to go cast a ballot in person. And so we have committed $32 million over the last year and a half to voting rights litigation, and we're going to continue to see this process through, not, by the way, just this year. We're going to continue to do this as long as priorities exist because we think it's that important.
Yeah, so let me ask you. I think my fans, my audience, which is I think even sophisticated by political punditry because it's so wonky and doesn't have a lot of saucy clickbaity stuff. they're frustrated and they're frankly afraid, right? Because it is a situation where, where we're talking about, okay, is it a win if you prevent, order the post office to stop delivering ballots after a certain date, right? Do you call that a win of the election if Donald Trump is able to win the election that way, right? So my fans and my followers are really interested in like feeling helpless. I think like, what can we do? They want to be able to physically do something, and of course, litigation it's a reactive rather than proactive response. So do you have any recommendations as for what people could be doing in terms of activities?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any question that a lot of cities and counties are going to need poll workers. That we've seen in the primaries, and I think we're expecting into the general, it's going to be more difficult to recruit poll workers, those that actually check people in, make sure that people are eligible, give them their ballot, because we know that there could be additional outbreak of the coronavirus. And so if you have an opportunity to volunteer, or in some cases it's a paid position to become a poll worker, you should do that. You can go to the DNC website or Biden's website. You can sign up to volunteer to be a poll watcher. There's going to be litigation, lawyers that are going to be needed to make sure that we're combating whatever the Republicans are doing leading up to Election Day and potentially even after. So be sure when you sign up at the DNC site or Joe Biden's site that you're saying that you want to be involved in this work. And the last thing you can do is you can go to Fair Fight, which is Stacey Abrams' group. You can make a contribution to Fair Fight. They are the single most important entity in terms of fighting voter suppression and making sure people have access to the ballot box. So if you can chip in $5, $100 to Fair Fight, you should do that. You should sign up to volunteer. The work they are doing is really important. Priorities is a supporter of Fair Fight. Stacey sits on our board, and I couldn't recommend them more in terms of figuring out ways that you can engage and volunteer for the election.
That's great, Guy. I wanted to close with that because it's just so important for people to understand. I think a lot of people, I know myself included, had planned to vote by mail, and I have actually, I'm going to risk my life and go into the ballot place and deliver my ballot personally. I'm going to vote in person because I want to just be sure my vote makes it there. But I do think that the poll watching problem, because the poll watching workforce tends to be extremely elderly. And in Wisconsin, in that state Supreme Court race that Ben Winkler was on talking about, only 6 out of 160 polling locations could be opened in Milwaukee. So that, that's a very legitimate reason that Republicans can curtail in-person voting. So we really need an army of 40 and under-year-old people to show up and offer to serve at this poll watching job for this one time that it's almost like a call to action. And I do want to just echo that sentiment that Guy mentioned. So Guy,
well, and I would just mention, if you are, if you want to vote by mail, make sure you get that request in and just return your ballot as soon as you get it.
Yeah,
and I think this is the, yeah, don't
yeah.
wait until the last week. Don't wait until the last couple of days. As soon as you get that ballot, make sure you fill it out, put it back in the mail. And I think, this is just a difference between our side and theirs. And this, going back to this idea, the way that we win this election is by making sure we're reaching out to as broad a coalition as possible. Mm-hmm. The reality is we have a real opportunity here, not just to win this election, but to win broadly, to make sure we're picking up House seats and Senate seats, and to win the presidency, to win state House seats, to win a couple of governor seats that we know are going to be competitive. And the way that we do that is by building that coalition. We need to be reaching out to the 3rd generation Cuban American in Miami, to the 4th generation farmer in Wisconsin that is going through bankruptcy and real challenges to keep the farm afloat because of this administration. We need to reach out to women in the suburbs, whether they're African American or white or AAPI. The way that we win is by building a broad coalition. And that's the way we're going to govern too once Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are elected. And so, we want to make sure everybody has access to that ballot box. This is not just about making sure that particular people have access or particular parts of states have access. We want people to get out and vote. And we know it's not just a matter of what's right and wrong, although that's true. we know that when people turn out of all types, of all backgrounds, that Democrats have a chance to win and to transform the country, to take care of people who just want to live into their God-given potential. They just want a fair shake. They just want an opportunity to be able to achieve their goals and their dreams. And that's what we need to be focused on. You know, this has been, as I'm sure for a lot of people, a pretty exhausting couple of years. It's been frustrating. It's been agonizing in some cases. It's been angering in some cases. I pretty much feel all of those things on a regular basis. But we've got a couple months left, and we just need to continue to do everything possible to make sure that we defeat Donald Trump and that we win up and down the ballot. And so I just want to make sure, if you haven't had a chance to volunteer, there's a lot of great organizations out there. Sign up, volunteer, chip in $5, get your ballot in early. Let's make sure that we're doing everything we can to win.
Yep, and don't let this pandemic stand in the way, because I can promise you the GOP has not missed a beat, and that's because, you know, they're not as worried about the pandemic, so they're out there knocking doors and holding rallies, and we just don't. As a social scientist, we just don't know what kind of effects that's going to have. So let's just do what you can do. Guy, I couldn't have said it better myself. What a perfect way to cash out my DNC special. I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking about the organization and telling us about the good work it's doing and all the good work that all these organizations are doing for democracy. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.